I don't know if you can win a press conference, but if you can, Walt Weiss just did it. Let's talk about it. Yes, welcome on into a special bonus episode of Braves Today for Tuesday, November 4th. This is your source for news, notes, and updates on your Atlanta Braves. I'm your host, Lindsey Crosby. You can follow me on social media at Crosby Baseball. You can follow the show on X, Braves_Today. We have a Facebook page and an Instagram as well. And you can find all of my written work, bravestoday.com. That's the Braves Today Substack, as this is both a podcast and a newsletter. We're proudly part of the Believe Podcast Network and presented to you by FanDuel. Go check out FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app today to get started with all of the action. They have 2026 World Series odds already up, or obviously NBA, NFL, NCAA football, hockey, all of that. All right, we just finished, we're maybe an hour out from having finished the press conference from Walt Weiss being introduced as Atlanta's new manager. And I've got a lot of thoughts here, but the first one is, if you can win a press conference, Walt Weiss just won the press conference. I still maintain that the biggest job of the manager is on the margins, right? It's getting the pinch hit situations right. It's getting the bullpen situation, the bullpen order right. It's the lineup, and it's managing the vibes and the guys, the highs and lows of a 162-game season, plus spring training, playoffs, and all of that. But I really feel like Walt Weiss did a really good job in this interview of bridging the gap between understanding how the Braves have always done things and the Braves way and the brand and the history, but also clarifying that he's different from Brian Snitker, and he does do things in a different way. So let's talk about that. And I think one of the big areas where I was incredibly impressed was the answers that Weiss gave when we talk about analytics. Because one of the common complaints about Brian Snitker has been, it felt like he had this weird relationship with some of the information. And I think what I'm specifically mentioning here is how, when it came to his lineup, he was very attached to handedness matchups. Lefties facing righties, righties facing lefties. And he would sometimes do that at the expense of what the numbers said. For instance, Drake Baldwin, who we expect to be Rookie of the Year, finished with a 274 average this year. He hit 267 against righties. He hit 299 against lefties. He hit 33 points better against lefties than he did righties. Despite that, do you know how many starts Drake Baldwin got against a lefty starter on the mound? 8. 89 of his 97 starts were against righties. And it's one of those situations where, despite what the numbers say, Snit wasn't necessarily willing to put him out there in those situations when he perhaps should have. Drake Baldwin got 95 plate appearances against lefties and 351 against righties. Now, some of that could be small sample size, yes, but the point is, it just, that was repeated numerous times with multiple members of the lineup. But then the flip side is, when you would go to the bullpen, a lot of the order of the bullpen guys felt like it was preordained, where it would be a very predictable order of how you were going to use your bullpen arms, no matter who was coming up. Right? You might be sending a lefty out there to face some righties because that was where he was set up to be in the bullpen order that night. Weiss signaled, or I guess explicitly said, he wants the information. He wants as much information as possible, and he wants to get better with how he uses it. So one, let me read the full answer on the first analytics question that he was asked. Shout out to Barrett Sallee of 680 The Fan for asking about how, since Colorado, a couple years ago, and we're going to get to Colorado, since being in Colorado, how had his understanding and use of analytics evolved and changed? Quote, look, I've evolved with the game. I think if you don't, you're a fool. My philosophy is, why would anybody, especially in a position of leadership, turn their back on information? And Alex has done a great job, his team has done a great job of blending the wisdom that comes from being in uniform for a number of years and the information that's available to us today and the technology that's available to us today. So I'm very curious when it comes to the information. I want it. And then there's a point where you've got to put context to it. I always say there's an art and a science to everything. The information gathering is the science part of it. And the art is putting context to it in the dugout and making it practical and pragmatic over the course of a 9-inning game. So yeah, I think you have to evolve. The game has changed, like I said, and you'd be a fool not to evolve with the game. It really, the impression that I get is he wants all the information possible, and then he's going to figure out the right way and the right bits of it to filter to the players. And anecdotally, one of the best things, or I guess one of the things that I've seen talked about with some of the best managers when it comes to analytics is not letting the players suffer from information overload, right? The biggest role of the manager, and we've seen examples of this, and I'll kind of clarify what I'm talking about. One of the biggest roles is being able to take the information, drill down to what does this player need to know about, and give it to him in a way that will be effective that he will use. And that's not just for analytics, that's for everything. I think a great example of this is Tim Hires talking about working with Michael Harris on fixing his hands and his timing at the plate. And Tim Hires talked about it and talked about it and talked about it. And do you know when things clicked for Michael Harris? When Chipper Jones had a conversation with him where he was relaying the same concept, but in a different way and as a different messenger, right? A different person, in this case, a very accomplished player and a Braves legend. So the fact that Weiss played, the fact that Weiss has these pre-existing relationships with these players, which he discussed, we're getting to that, and the fact that he wants the information and he understands the job is not giving that information to the players. The job is figuring out what and how to give the information to the players. Gives me belief that, one, the things that the manager needs to decide on, like bullpen usage, like the lineup and everything, there's a chance he's going to do that in a more optimized way than Brian Snitker did. And the information the players need, he understands his job is to figure out how to give it to them in an actionable way. So hopefully, based on these pre-existing relationships that he has, he's going to be able to do that better, to do that quicker. And he was kind of he did talk about wanting to get better with this. He said, he quote, I'm very open and always very curious to get better in that realm. But he does trust the team that Alex has assembled that gets that information. Quote, those relationships are rock solid and deep rooted. There's a lot of trust there. I value the information that I get from our team upstairs. And I think one of the big things the other reason why I believe he's going to be better about using these analytics than Snitker was when he talked about the difference in their personalities. And you need different personalities and mindsets and everything. And one of the things that stood out to me was when Weiss talked about his approach versus Snit's approach. And Weiss said, quote, my personality is always to hurry up and get in there and fix things. Watching Snit have a feel for the timing of when to interject was very valuable for me. I do think both in a good way and a bad way, one of Brian Snitker's traits was being very patient when things weren't going well. And there's times we saw it work out. Let's look at 2023. Marcell Ozuna had a terrible first month. I remember doing a podcast that speculated we were like a week away from getting DFA'd. Brian Snitker stuck with them. He had that massive series in Miami. And from that point, at the end, I think it was like the very beginning of May of 2023, through the end of 2024, he was one of the best hitters in baseball. But the flip side of this is, we saw when it took him too long to make changes, like when you were struggling to get Raisel Iglesias going this season, and it took until June for them to try somebody else at closer and to ask him to shelve the slider, right? Like, we can see the pros and the cons in both sides of this. Weiss talking about his personality is to get in there and fix the problem quickly makes me feel like he's going to be more willing to make a change earlier in a failing process than Snitker's extreme patience. Because Snitker was on the end of like that extreme, I'm going to wait as long as humanly possible before I do this. So I feel good about that. In just a minute, let's talk about why we probably should not hold the Colorado tenure against him. One of the main arguments that has been made against Walt Weiss was that he was not good as a manager in Colorado. Let me explain why he wasn't set up for success. We'll do that next, right here on Braves Today. Welcome back to a special bonus edition of Braves Today. Lindsey Crosby talking about the promotion of Walt Weiss to manager and his press conference that he had on Tuesday morning in Truist Park. And one of the common complaints against Walt Weiss, and I understand, I'm not saying it's wrong, is that he wasn't very good in Colorado, right? That in his 4 seasons in Colorado, 2013 through 2016, the Colorado Rockies were 283 and 365. So it's a 437 winning percentage. They finished in last place twice, they finished in 4th place once, and they finished in 3rd place once. And I think there's a couple things to remember about this. And the first one, and he talked about this in his press conference, was at the time, like his first season, Colorado was coming off what was then the worst season in their history, right? In 2012, they were 64 and 98. That's a 395 winning percentage. And at the time, it was the worst in team history. Now, clearly since then, 23, 24, and 25 have all been worse, right? 2023, they were 59 and 103. It's a 364 winning percentage. Then they were 101 losses, so a 377. Then 119 losses at a 265 winning percentage. But before that, they came off the worst season they had ever had. And so he had to spend that first year just kind of learning his players. He explained it takes like a year to get to know your guys, like to really understand them from the perspective of like their motivations, how they handle certain situations, their body language and all of that. But also, he was not in baseball before he became the manager of the Rockies. So when he retired, he did some work for Colorado's front office. And he spent like 8 years working as like a special assistant to the GM for 8 years. He had been coaching his his son's high school football team when he got a call asking him to interview for the managerial job in Colorado. He had been away from baseball for 4 years when he got a call to interview for the job. And he never thought he would get the job. He was ready to get back into baseball. And so he said, okay, why not? I'll take the interview. It'll be some good experience. I'll learn a lot. And then I can go look for a coaching gig. And then he got the Colorado managerial job. Like, it's not a surprise that he wasn't very good. He was away from the game for 4 years before he became the manager. But he did say he learned a lot, right? And there's a lot of quotes in here about that. One of them, quote, like, where were you 12 years ago? If you haven't become a little wiser, you need to check yourself. But I think the whole thing here, and my big takeaway on this, is like, he was very clear. He's proud of some of the things they did, right? He's proud of the effort that they gave in Colorado. He's proud of some of the things that they did. There was a lot of extra stuff that they had to deal with that he doesn't expect to deal with in Atlanta. He didn't go into specifics, but it sounds to me like it's some of the organizational dysfunction that we know Colorado has had for a long time, right? And it sounds like he was dealing with, issues with the players that he didn't know that well coming off of the worst season in franchise history. It felt like a lot of Colorado-specific obstacles. He obviously did not go into details. He's never going to. But the point remains, he said he learned a lot. And he wouldn't be here if not for that. He also wouldn't be here if not for Brian Snitker. Brian Snitker's the one that, that got Walt Weiss in Atlanta, got him back over here, got him working. Because when he left Colorado, it was essentially immediately when he came over to Atlanta. And he's discussed about really learning a lot from Brian Snitker the time he's been here. And it's not just been how to be patient, right? But understanding the manager's role after losses, understanding all of what goes into being a manager. And AA talked about this too. It's not just managing the players. That's a big part of it. That's a huge part of it. And arguably the biggest part of the job of the manager is just directly working with those players, managing those guys on a day-to-day basis, keeping the mood in the clubhouse light, getting obstacles out of the guys' way so they can perform to the best of their abilities. That's the number one role of the manager in Major League Baseball. But also understanding how to talk to the media, understanding how to work with the front office, with the analytics staff, dealing with all of the extra stuff that comes along with being a manager that you don't have to deal with when you're a bench coach, right? You are the figurehead for that day's game, good or bad. And we don't have the ability to put video of press conferences, whole on the site anymore. But the manager meets with the media before and after every game. Brian Snitker would be in the interview room before the game, or sometimes like the dugout during BP or things like that. He'd be in the interview room after the game. He would talk to the media multiple times every single day about things. Walt Weiss discussed learning about all of the different responsibilities that go into being a manager, sitting under Brian Snitker and doing that. I'm really curious to see who he hires, right? One of the things that they touched on, but they did not have any news to report, is the staff around him. AA said, quote, "This was pretty quick. That's a conversation we're going to continue to have, so we don't have anything to announce today." This was something Walt Weiss had staff decisions to make. AA had staff decisions or ideas on the staff. And so, quote, "Those are priority things we're going to work through the next little bit. We don't have anything today, but that's definitely a front burner priority for us." I am really curious to see what changes they make, right? Bench coach, what happens there? Simply because obviously that was Walt Weiss's job. Do they find a way to put Chipper Jones in, on the coaching staff? He tweeted yesterday after the announcement was made that he really, he loved the hire. He was in person at the press conference today. Chipper Jones was in attendance at the press conference. I believe he went on 680 The Fan afterwards to talk about liking the hire. He's a fan of Walt Weiss. He thinks it's a good move. Do they find a way to get him on the staff as an assistant hitting coach or the hitting coach or something like that? Rick Kranitz feels like a guy that should be retained. Who do they bring in from the outside? Do they bring back a former Brave that Weiss worked with? Like I've talked about Eric Young Sr. coming back to the staff as a first base coach because he was one of the main reasons that Atlanta was one of the best base running teams in baseball, despite the fact that it's largely the same roster that is now one of the slowest and worst base running teams in baseball. Like that's what Eric Young Sr. did. Do they look to bring him back? Do they bring somebody from outside the organization or somebody who has not been a Brave before? Right? We did not get a lot of specifics, but the next couple days, I imagine we're going to hear AA had given those coaches the green light to interview for other jobs if requested. Like if somebody said, hey, we want to interview you for a lateral move, AA said until the manager was hired, he couldn't guarantee their job. And so he gave them permission to interview for open jobs. We've not had reports of any of Atlanta's guys going anywhere. We've not had reports of any of Atlanta's guys sitting down to interview for either promotions or the jobs that they have now. My expectation would be a bulk of this staff would come back. You probably see a couple changes. I'm really curious as to what that might be. But I do also think the really interesting thing here is the process. Okay, and AA talked about this. Because one of the big questions we've kind of all had, and I touched on it a little bit yesterday in that live show that I wasn't very eloquent with my thoughts in there. But with that live show about, like, why did it take this long to just hire Snit's bench coach? And AA kind of talked about the whole process really accelerated on Saturday. The World Series was not holding them up. They had the ability to interview anybody they wanted to interview, request permission, off days, all that stuff. That's common in baseball. He said the World Series did not hold them up, but knowing the end of the World Series was coming kind of got them going a little bit. He had the quote here, I had some conversations on Saturday that really impacted me and was still chewing on it and going through stuff, and ultimately had a few more that I needed to have on Monday just to make sure that I checked all those boxes. And he said those Monday calls were pretty impactful. And he didn't name names, but pretty impactful people. Said he was leaning towards Weiss, but he wanted to talk to some more people, quote, who were around him a little bit more than anybody else, that I had significant faith and trust in what they had to say. I told them I was leaning in that direction, but wanted to make sure that there wasn't anything that I miss, and they both stamped it a lot of ways. And stamp of approval is what he's talking about. And then after those conversations on Monday, AA went to Terry McGurk, the chairman, broke down the thought process, broke down the background work and everything that he did, what he did to check off all the boxes. He did say it was his decision. It was not Terry McGurk's decision. It was not the board. It was Alex Anthopoulos' decision. But it took all this time because they wanted to make sure they got it right. They did not have a requirement. It had to be internal or external. Quote, it's the best person you know, period. You need the right person, the right individual, no matter where they come from, and he stood out as the right man for the job. At the end of the day, this isn't an exciting hire. I think that Walt Weiss said everything, or he said all of the right things in the press conference, right? And he gave some hope that he would be able to improve on the deficiencies of Brian Snitker without significantly changing the way things are done in Atlanta. And I think at the end of the day, with a veteran-laden roster that cannot just take the status quo, but does not yet need a massive shakeup, I think that's the right approach. Now, obviously, time's going to tell what will it take for him, like, when will we determine this is a success or a failure? If he does what Snit said, win the division, what Snit did, win the division 6 straight years and win a World Series, clearly that's a success. But I did not hear anything today that made me think this is not going to work out. Now, we just need the actual games to happen. Thanks for joining us for an extra bonus edition of Braves Today for Tuesday, November 4th. If you missed the actual press conference on bravestoday.com, in the story that I wrote about the press conference, we included a link to the press conference on YouTube so you can go watch the whole thing. In the meantime, do us a favor. If you're listening on audio, a 5-star review with some kind words would be fantastic. If you're watching on YouTube, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell for when we drop shorts, we go live, we do bonus episodes like this, and all of that. Until next time, this has been Braves Today.